Yeah, lots of Louisville people today. Well, it looks like people are mostly in the room, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are in Central Time. Um, my name is Evan Barker. I'm the Southeast Regional Manager for Narrative 4, and I'm delighted to be here today because I don't often get to meet OST providers, but I really appreciate your work. So, I have a little presentation for you today about empathy education and story exchange and storytelling and possibilities. And I hope that you find it hopeful. I hope you find it inspiring and that you bring something back to your kids and that it maybe pours a little something into you as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides and get started. Okay. So now, at any point here along the way, please feel free to interrupt me, ask some questions. I don't want to just teach into the void. I was a high school language arts teacher here in Kentucky for the better part of 9 years before I left that world to join Narrative 4. And so when I'm introducing our programming, I'm speaking teacher, but I also want to make sure that we leave space for people who are educators in a OST capacity, because you are caring for kids even if it happens after 3 p.m. So Narrative 4 is a global literary organization. I am physically here in Kentucky as a full-time employee, and I'm responsible for this region. And we are a literary organization that connects people using the power of story. We hope to expand empathy, shatter stereotypes, create connection. So I'm not going to read this verbatim, but in essence, Narrative 4 grew out of a really simple question. And that question was, what is the highest aim of storytelling? And depending on who you are in your relationship to story, you may have a different answer to that. But the answers that people seem to center on, stories build connection, stories make us understand each other, stories can foster peace, they can build curiosity. They can make people care about each other. They can ultimately, it's all about empathy, the ability for the human in me to see the human in you. And we have a method called the story exchange, which we've used all around the world. And that's how I got into this, but more on that later. And our ultimate goal is that we empower youth to equip themselves with empathy so that as they become leaders, they can make more empathetic choices and they can raise a better generation of kids coming behind them. That the high school students of today are the, you know, doctors, lawyers, plumbers, and electricians of tomorrow. And we hope that they do better than we did. Not to mention the need for connection in the wake of the pandemic, the complicated political situation. There are all sorts of reasons why people are torn apart these days, but empathy is the thing that puts us back together. And our vision is all people better lives, because we mean that all people should live better lives, and meaningful connection is the one thing that everybody in the world needs. So at the moment, I can't rattle them all off, but Narrative 4 has a pretty substantial footprint in the US, but I'm going to play for you a video showing some of our work in Ireland. I have a colleague in Mexico. We have several offices in Africa, specifically South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. But there's also some programming in Zimbabwe. Um, and we're kind of working into Europe at the moment as we also kind of saturate in the United States. And if any of you caught the Today Show this past Friday, you may have seen Narrative 4 featured in a What's Working Today clip, which I have for you to play a little bit later. All right, so the basic language in Narrative 4 is about using story to access empathy. And when we run a story exchange, we try to have our participants, we solicit their own understanding of empathy. And when we're working with students, we sometimes have to tease that out a bit. But I've found that kids, even as young as 8, can tell you what empathy is if you give them enough kind of opportunities. But these are the 4 planks that we stand upon to define empathy. So obviously now, why is empathy important? Well, uh, I think for many of us in a school setting, such as myself, you show up for the day charged with so many missions. You have students to teach, you have to take attendance, you have administrative tasks, you have very concrete goals that don't really involve human beings in the same way that people who are care providers, whereas if you're a doctor and you walk into a hospital, your job is to heal people. And people who care for kids, you have many tasks, and they're not all entirely directly tied to caring for the whole child. But anybody who's been in front of kids knows that a child who is cared for with their Maslow hierarchy of needs met, a child who's fed and healthy and clothed can learn much easier than somebody whose needs are not met. And we tend to focus on those things first, and that's why we have things like school breakfast and transportation and youth service centers, and those things are all crucially important. But schools are a little bit blind to dealing with the whole child and social emotional learning. And in recent days, that's even become a little bit contentious because uh, the way we ask people to empathize with each other sometimes means that we have hard conversations. And because we're naturally afraid to have hard conversations, sometimes we choose not to. And sometimes choosing not to do something hard causes harm. And so empathy is something that everybody can have for everybody else. And it makes everybody feel better and closer. But it is and isn't certain things. We can build connections through trust. I'm not going to read all these, but I'm interested if anybody wants to unmute and offer something that they feel like empathy does. I'd love to hear you. I'd like to highlight one or two things here. Empathy increases our likelihood of taking compassionate action. We say, and Dr. Brene Brown, the empathy scholar, says that compassion is empathy being put to action. So if you imagine sort of concentric circles growing larger to take your heart with it, pity is something very small. Sympathy is something a little bit larger. Empathy is pretty large, and compassion encompasses all of that, where you can see somebody's world and you can choose to act on their behalf in a way that can help them. You can expand your imagination. You can understand multiple viewpoints. The the story exchange increases empathy by doing both of the things listed on this graphic. So perspective taking is very important. We often, with little kids, we ask kids to read stories frequently, and we ask them to think about what would they do if they were in the position of the character in the story. And everybody who was raised on, the Berenstain Bears and Arthur and cartoons like that knows that a good story can really make you consider other people's viewpoints, and that's great. And that's why we have story. And at the same time, storytelling and narratives allow you to internalize other people's experience that you can't get close to. So if we say that empathy is kind of like walking a mile in someone's shoes, um, storytelling is the art of conveying that empathy to somebody else in a way that makes sense to them as well. That you can tell somebody's story without taking on their personhood or their identity. And you can't actually live their experience, but you can try it on for size and imagine what it might be like and give you a window into their world. So the narrative for story exchange does both of these things, and I'll explain. So a lot of this is based on schools, but obviously, school is wherever children are meeting, because children are always learning, whether we are teaching them intentionally or not. As I know from my own kids around the house, they pick things up all the time, whether I meant for them to or not. A climate of empathy in your setting for your students, regardless of where that is, increases engagement, It makes people less likely to have conflict. It makes the conflicts easier to resolve. It makes people more engaged and curious. And that's really where the learning happens, that you all hopefully have seen a student get really curious about something and suddenly, you can't hold them back. They just want to teach themselves. And that's where we want all the students to be all the time, because then their natural curiosity is driving their learning. And that's a great day when you have students in that zone. But obviously, it's real hard to get there. So the narrative for story exchange, now there are adults pictured in this and older teens, but I do want to point out here that we have worked with kids as young as kindergarten. We just set the table in different ways, and so I can get into the weeds about that later. But a story exchange is basically a process where we invite people to join a common space, whether it's in person or virtual. We use the graphic that I showed you earlier and a few other slides to talk about empathy and perspective taking and deep listening in ways that make sense with the demographic you're working with. So we use their language to access their understanding of what it means to be empathetic. We provide a set of prompts for a story, and we ask people to tell a story from their lives, but not the story of their lives. In other words, we want people to share an episode, but we don't want them to share the whole series, and we don't want them to preach on a topic. We just want them to talk about a thing that happened to them. And those stories can be grounded in any emotion. You can tell a story about a day that changed your life, for example, or a time when somebody made you feel welcome, or a story of a time when community mattered. And so we shaped the story exchange based on the venue and the audience and different factors, so that we're getting a rich experience for everybody in that room. One of my favorite things to ask teachers is tell a story of a time when you knew you were meant to be an educator, because you get people's why stories out of those days. With students, we ask them to tell a story of a great day with somebody older than them. And you get a lot of grandpa took me fishing stories and things like that, or the big kids let me play. And we pair the participants up and we give them some privacy, whether it's a breakout Zoom room or whether it's two chairs on the porch. And we ask people to spend 25 or so minutes together sharing their stories one to one. And we ask that people listen deeply and listen to understand, but not to respond. And that if they choose to take notes, they just take down sign points. And when we reconvene them into the circle, as depicted here in the left side photo, each participant would share their partner's story in the first person using first person pronouns. So if Stephanie and I were partnered, I would say, my name is Stephanie Barker, and this is the story of the time I had a baby on Mother's Day, or something like that. And she would have to voice my story in the first person. And a curious thing happens when you do this. You can't transcribe the other person's story. It has to come out of your own head. And so you find yourself imagining the experience and wording it in a way to convey the story, to do justice to the other person's story because you empathize with them, and also to make it make sense to the listeners in the room. And it's the same sort of psychology as when you get really wrapped up in a good book and the characters just grip you and you feel like you have to tell somebody about it. So you can't actually live the person's experience, but you can tell about it as if you had. And if you're doing fidelity to your partner's story, they will hopefully feel heard, and you will feel like you've learned something and been somewhere. And the partners in the room may learn something different about a person that they're just sitting across from. So that's the story exchange. And I'll pause here for a moment, and ask anybody, if you want to unmute, and feel free to ask questions or or comment. Or I can play a video so that if you're tired of me. No questions or comments. Okay. Moving on. So I think I'd like to play you all a short video, because I want you to see a breadth of experience. And we have a great 1-minute video from our program in Ireland. And I like this one because the Irish Ministry of Education has seized on Narrative 4 as a way to, they call it empathy education in their schools. We don't use the same language here in the States. but they are working this program predominantly in secondary grades. And at this point, the cool thing about Narrative for Ireland is, there are about as many people in Ireland as there are in Kentucky. So it is a smaller place, but they're able to reach most of the country at this point. And so the students and students in any corner of Ireland at this point have story exchange as a common language. And if you were running a program involving students in Ireland, you could get any group of teenagers together, and it's likely that they'd be familiar with story exchange, and you could use it to build group culture and camaraderie right away because they're already familiar. So I'm going to share that video for a moment because their accents are magnificent.
Narrative 4 believes that stories have an innate power to develop empathy in society. We have an evidence-based method called the story exchange that is an empathy education program, and it helps to teach emotional and social skills in young people, and it helps to improve their well-being. Since we got on board with Rethink Ireland, we've been able to scale our program. We are now in 150 schools across 25 counties, and we've trained 440 teachers and youth workers to run our program in their schools.
The students love the program, and it builds such connection between the young people. I think it's really empowering to witness that and be part of that change in the world.
Our aim is to have our program running in every school and youth organisation in Ireland. This means then that every young person gets an opportunity to take part in the empathy education program and reap the benefits of it.
Cool. So let me hop back in here. So I have a series of slides next to kind of show you different implementations of N4. And I think this is where we can get a little bit into the weeds about how we've applied ourselves differently in the 10 years that we've been around. We actually just celebrated our 10th anniversary in November, and there's actually a really big Kentucky connection about this. And I'm not sure if anybody did catch the Today Show, but I'm very fortunate to be hosting a group of students doing a Narrative for field exchange here later in the spring. And so we'll be bringing a group of students from New York City to Eastern Kentucky to spend a few days really learning from each other with their Floyd County partners. So well, my bread and butter is to go into schools, and I do this inside of a classroom or across a grade level or in an advisory group. Those are just some ways that works. College and community groups, we often will use themed story work in specific venues. Like if you were dealing with, for example, a youth group with kids who live in a specific neighborhood, you could do a story exchange about their place and their home, and not necessarily their home life, like where they go to sleep, but kind of their upbringing in the place where they live, so they could examine kind of the importance that place has in their lives. Because these are things that don't often find their way into like traditional education. We don't talk about place, we sort of talk around it. Difference in identity. When we talk about identity, I want to say here too that we're not doing like identity politics where we're asking people to write down their demographics and put it on their forehead like a sign. We ask people to think about the individual connections between one and another. And for those of you who are in Louisville, I've been to the W.B. Du Bois School several times, and I work with a teacher there named Chris. And when I go to work with Chris, sometimes I'm the only white face in the building, and Chris is an older black man from Louisville. And obviously, like, his students know that when I am saying that I'm Chris, they know that I'm not taking on his identity. I can't have, his blackness or his own experience, but I can take his story and voice it faithfully to how he's told me, in the same way that he can do to me. And they learn that the obvious sort of surface level differences are not the important ones, and that we can lean into differences because they're actually exciting and interesting. They're not scary. Oh, actually, I want to back up here. Recently, I was in a youth center here in Richmond that backs up to what you might call a sort of challenging neighborhood. And the students in that group don't necessarily want to tell stories about their lives. So I brought a little Bluetooth speaker and we had a music exchange where I asked them to pick something school appropriate and something that was in their Spotify lately and share it with the group. And so the students actually story exchanged each other's pieces of music. And I heard some amazing things out of these eighth graders who were initially pretty resistant because they put their walls up to avoid talking to each other. But mediating the experience through music or art really helped. I got to see some smiles again. The art exchange, for example, this works with really well with middle grade students. We take a story exchange and break it over a few days to change to spread the experience out. And we ask the students, we give them some art supplies, and we encourage them to create a piece of art that encompasses their partner's story, so that when they do the story exchange, they're actually sharing a piece of artwork that depicts what that they've learned from their partner, and then you give them to the partner as a gift. So I have a piece of book art upstairs that I received at a staff retreat that's very precious to me because somebody took time to make it based on my story. Here we have some inter-school exchanges. These are students in they're in Israel or Palestine, depending on how you look at it and whom you ask. But these neighborhoods are in East Jerusalem predominantly, and that's one place where Arabs and Jews live in the same neighborhoods and go to schools together. And so this is one place where the schools are conducted in English so that they're kind of on neutral ground. And we did what we called an object exchange with these kids where they brought something that was important to them in the photo here, and then they story exchanged the item, kind of like grown-up show and tell. And you got to see that, oh, maybe Arabs and Jews both go and do boxing at the gym, and maybe they have that in common. Maybe they have other things that are not in common, but they do have something to lean on. Now, the field exchange is what I wanted to talk with you all a little bit about because I'm really excited about it. So the Narrative 4 Field Exchange was born out of the question of, could people from very different worlds find lasting connection and common ground? And so we partnered two schools from about as different of environments as you can imagine. University Heights High School is in the South Bronx, and it's a predominantly immigrant community, along with a kind of legacy Black American community. And then Floyd Central is actually a new high school that was formed out of consolidation. So South Floyd High, and I can't remember which one, but they consolidated two high schools into one fairly recently to build this new high school in Floyd County. And so these students had to overcome some, geographic differences and some real cultural differences to kind of understand each other. And we've done this project twice now. But the fun part about this spring is that we brought the students from Kentucky to New York in November to spend a few days in the Bronx with their partners. And in April, we are bringing the New York City kids to Floyd Central, to Floyd County, to spend some time here in Appalachia and learn, about Appalachian food. We're going to take them to a former coal camp. We're going to do some square dancing. They're actually going to throw the students a homecoming dance because they learned that University Heights doesn't do homecoming. And they're going to get a little bit of a taste of primary source history work at the Hyman Settlement School, where the good people at Hyman are working on saving their archives after last summer's flooding. And so these kids are actually going to see primary source material about Appalachian history and culture, and it's going to be shown to them by kids who live in the region. And we'll be doing a big story exchange on Friday, the 28th of April at Floyd Central High School. For those of you who are in the neighborhood, email me because we're going to have spaces there to bring people into the exchange and invite a broad group of people from the community. This one, I was not there for this one with police officers and youth. As you can imagine how charged this is, especially those of you who are in Louisville today. Given current events. But I don't know if you would be surprised if I told you that the group that was very nervous about this exchange was actually the one in uniform. The teenagers were curious and the adults were terrified. And it turned into this really great experience for these teens. But this is obviously kind of a high stakes exchange, but you can do this if people have practiced story exchange and are willing to be empathetic, if they know what they're getting into. This is an event that we did about migration. Lots of people on this call who had moved continents, moved countries, learned new languages. Oh, there's actually Fatu in the upper right corner here is one of our interns now, but she was one of the students from the original field exchange who came to Kentucky. And there's Maru, who is our Mexico regional manager. So we do the virtual story exchange really frequently. This is one of my favorite things to do with people who are in different sites. And so I did take a poll at the beginning to see who was here from which place, and I was hoping we get more Oklahoma representation. But if it turned out that we had people whose work matched between Kentucky and Oklahoma, we could organize story exchanges to be held on Zoom between students in one place and students in another. For example, that's what we do all day. So when organizations partner with Narrative 4, we assign an advisor. Sometimes that's me, sometimes that's someone else. And we delve into your own individual context and we figure out, well, what's a way to use story work that actually furthers your goals? And if you were to partner with somebody in a different place, who would that be and what might that look like? So we have kind of year-long plans and we can curate materials for you to further your own learning goals so that you're not having to write everything from scratch all the time. And we can connect you with other people who do the same practice so that you have support. I also wanted to show you briefly on our website here, we have learning resources which are built for all ages. Obviously, a lot of this looks like high school English, but there's quite a variety of material there. And the overarching goal is for students to take the empathy and the curiosity and leverage that into authentic civic engagement. And so you can see we have, like, for example, here, goals and models for civic engagement. The purpose of the field exchange between the University Heights kids and the Floyd Central kids is we are asking them about the strengths of their communities and the needs of their communities. And these students are working together on biweekly Zoom calls right now to plan civic engagement that they can deploy in their hometowns of Floyd County and New York City in ways that leverage what they have to offer and also actually meet needs. Because too often civic engagement looks like charity instead of something that's responsive to the needs of the community. So I'll pause there. And I'd love to open the discussion a little bit. If we don't have a whole lot to say, I can show you the video from the field exchange from the Today Show last week. It's really exciting. But I'd love to hear more about any questions that you have or ways that you think perhaps that this might work in your venue. So just, it's completely open, just jump in. Amanda says, works with K through 3 primarily. How do you get kids to participate with the story exchange and not make jokes or fun of each other? Boys take few things seriously. Yeah, I know that world. And honestly, you're doing the Lord's work if you can work with K3 kids. That's especially after school, especially after they're so fried. The littles are so tough. Maru, my aforementioned Mexico regional manager, she actually did this at a school called the American School in Tampico, and they called her Senora Empathy because she was a high school teacher, but she would go back and work with the early grades because she was tasked with social emotional learning. And with the younger kids, the very little ones, they wouldn't do story exchange directly at all because that's kind of an involved event. They would sort of build up to that. And so Maro used to do things like bring, a box with, a question mark on it. And she would ask the students to ask her questions, like to play 20 questions about the box, because she was trying to get them to ask questions, to make inferences, to remember what their peers had said, to kind of like work off of each other. And, to ask questions to deepen understanding. And so when they could ask questions to understand, she could give them something else to do that was maybe a little bit closer to story exchange. part of the weirdness of story exchange is that the first one's really weird. That it just is. My first one was very strange. Everybody, even adults who are very comfortable with themselves, go into this and not know what they're getting. But if you can kind of rip the band-aid off and get to the end of the experience and people say, oh, I changed my perspective because somebody told my story. I know that that doesn't sound like it applies to the little ones, but if you can focus the questioning down to how did it feel to tell a story that didn't happen to you and get them to kind of camp out in that space a little bit, they can think about perspectives that aren't their own, even though at that age, kids are developmentally not really wired to understand perspectives that aren't theirs. The youngest I've seen a traditional story exchange was with second grade kids, and they just needed some help setting the table as far as how you tell a story and how you remember details and how you put things in order and how you make sure that you're not laughing at something that happened to somebody else, but that you're trying to treat them the way that you would want to be treated. And honestly, and lastly, for that one, I would probably not go straight into a like oral story exchange for little kids. I would probably give them something like the object exchange is a way better way to get started, because everybody understands that if they bring something that they like in to share with people, they don't want it to be harmed. And so you can start from that point where you're doing kind of grown-up show and tell. And then from there, you could move into something like a book exchange, like where you bring your favorite picture book. And from there, you could probably tell a story and get the students to do a real story exchange at that point. But you would have to kind of work into the process. It's not a one-time thing. It's a great question. I don't want to put anybody on blast, but I'm wondering, Linda from Lincoln County High School, is Ingrid Williams still teaching English over there? A friend of mine is a teacher in that department, and
Yes, yes,
is
she
she?
is. Hmm.
Ingrid's great. We talked about working with her at one point, and at the time that we had talked, I did not have a better way to support her, but there was lots of talk about literacy. And when you're with high school students, the the biggest challenge you have is that the teachers have kind of specific goals that sort of run on rails, and if they're going to do something like a story exchange, they need an extra pair of hands. So they need somebody who can come in and kind of help them work this process. And then if they want to take this and point it back into like engaging with a piece of literature, they know how to do that, but they might need somebody to say, okay, here's how you're going to take story and use it as an entry point to this book, or use it to discuss the questions that this book raises. Because oftentimes people teach literature as being very, very specifically focused on the text rather than kind of zooming out into the implications that it has for us. And if that's a space where you can have really, really rich exchange around something that they're doing in class, as long as you've got an extra pair of hands to lend.
I'm going to see if I can get a hold of her with that, and we might try to do something like that here with maybe another school in the state.
Yeah, well, that would be amazing. And I have so many people all over the place. I've got so many friends in so many places. I like nothing more than getting to parachute into somebody's English class and see how they teach lit, because that was my world. And they should see the partnering with somebody else as kind of a goal where, you know, in order to do that really well, if you can imagine the kids from Kentucky and New York, they had to be very skilled at story exchange and very willing to be open before they could broach the topic of meeting new people, because meeting new people for teenagers is really, really scary. But now that they do it, they could talk to anybody. When the Today Show was there were these kids talking the ears off of the NBC executives who came to see the story exchange. And I thought it was the greatest thing, because how often do teenagers actually hold their own with adults? They're usually kind of just, you know, seen and not heard, or heard, but we wish we didn't hear them as much. So I know I focused a lot about the story exchange, and I do want to say that, like, anybody who is not quite seeing how this would work in an OST setting, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to me, because the becoming a trained facilitator is kind of the first thing. And it's sort of like I want to use the metaphor of like cooking class. I can teach you how to make one recipe out of a box, but if I teach you how to cook instead, then you're capable of adapting. And when you are a trained facilitator, you can then say, this is the theory and this is the practice with my students, and you'll understand how to manipulate those variables, just like you would with any other activity. So in order to be involved with N4, we ask that you attend a story exchange as a participant, which you can do by going to our website, and there's a link that says tell your story, and you can just sign up for a Zoom story exchange at no cost, and they happen several times a week, and you want to spend about 2 hours, narrative4.com. And at that point, I can give you access to the online facilitator training, or if you're in an institution where you have a staff and you want to do an in-person training, I do those as well. Oklahoma people, I'm going to give you another email address. You can speak with my boss, Ashley Pinciaro, the director of U.S. operations, because Oklahoma doesn't slot into any of our regions, but we still serve them. I should say. This is for Oklahoma. And this is me here in Kentucky. Kentucky and surrounding states. So I'm actually in charge of Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Carolinas, and Virginias. So if you have colleagues in other states who do the same work, and you're in the same time zone, it's actually not that difficult to get 2 groups of students into a story exchange together. Although, again, you want to build up to that. If you want to spend 4 minutes to watch the Today Show video, I'd really love to show you that, because that is actually very current and really exciting about our today work. So I'm going to switch back to that. And if you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and we can address a few. And then I could probably cut you all loose early so you can reclaim your afternoon.
For perfect strangers, students from a high school in rural Kentucky come to visit students in the South Bronx. Their schools have forged a unique bond through a program called Narrative 4.
Hearing each other's stories.
The idea is simple. Each participant shares a personal story with a student from the other school. We sat in on a story exchange between 16-year-old Charlotte Estrella from New York City and 17-year-old Taylor Allen from Kentucky. 2 young women from drastically different backgrounds, each offering something very personal. Taylor sharing her story of devastating loss.
My grandparents live right next door, and I always clung to my papa. He was always my best friend. And a doctor comes in, and, they're saying, well, we're not 100% sure, but we think it's cancer.
After she finishes, Charlotte shares her own story of a scary medical crisis.
But there was just this one day, it's like the feeling was like so much pain in like my stomach area. I was like crying, and turns out my appendix had burst.
While one speaks, the other listens and absorbs. Narrative 4 operates story exchanges like these in 600 schools nationwide and across more than 35 countries. When they paired Floyd County High in Kentucky with University Heights High in the South Bronx in 2017, the students didn't know what to make of each other. Through story exchanges, the differences fell away. Soon, they were swapping recipes. Narrative 4 was co-founded by National Book Award-winning author Colin McCann. He says inhabiting someone else's perspective helps dissolve the barriers that divide us.
They recognize each other's common humanity. They'll go out into the world and they'll do something, and they'll make the world bigger and better, which is what these extraordinary young people do.
And right here in the Bronx, 2 worlds come together by sharing stories. The second part of the story exchange starts when students recount their partner's stories as if it's their own. Taylor tells the group of Charlotte's appendicitis as if it happened to her.
I'm in excruciating pain, and then that's when the doctors realized that my appendix had burst.
And
Charlotte sharing Taylor's story of losing her granddad, as if the heartbreak was hers.
He started fighting and struggling a lot, and he sadly passed away.
The exchange reveals vulnerability and strength. Each story arc pulls the circle closer, binding these students together by shared experiences. How did it feel? How did it go?
It was an amazing experience to hear everyone's story.
Yeah, I noticed while Charlotte was sharing your story, people got a little emotional.
It was heartwarming to me to see all the support from people I've known for a day crying over my story.
What do you think you'll carry away from this experience?
No matter how different we think we are, we always have similarities, and that empathy is a really big thing, and everyone should practice it.
Giving a piece of yourself to a stranger and trusting them to share it.
This exchange is about not only about telling, but it's also about listening. When you carefully shepherd somebody else's story, that's the way that you can actually change the world for the better.
I had never heard of the program, the concept either, and then I go and I see it firsthand. It should be in every high school.
So it works.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's genius.
Yeah.
I mean, because it teaches empathy. If you fully inhabit someone else's story and then you share that story as your own, it really, I got a little teary.
It's like literally walking in somebody else's shoes,
Yeah.
like that adder.
You're wearing
them.
Yeah. And here's the thing. The principal at University Heights High says that the Narrative 4 Story Exchange program has helped increase both attendance and graduation rates at the school.
Win-win.
Phenomenal.
Great program.
I got a good feeling about this.
Well, you can see why I'm partial to that video. But also they shot that in November and we didn't know what it was going to look like and who they were going to feature and stuff until it just aired last week. So we're excited to host the New York kids. And in particular, I like the fact that there are a lot of kids around the world who have their concept of what American kids are is based on meeting students from Kentucky in a story exchange. And so the kind of like the media representation of who we are here is sometimes incomplete, but there are kids in Palestine who know a great deal about life in Appalachia because they've story exchanged with kids from Floyd County, and so they can tell our story honestly, whoever we are. And so I know many of you are in like kind of after school time and middle grades and stuff. I do want to say to anybody who's in Louisville, if you're familiar with J. Graham Brown, I was recently at the J. Graham Brown School where one of our teacher facilitators, Tyler Jones, works, and we trained some of his middle school students actually to facilitate for each other, like as a peer support. And I got to go and see that last month, and the middle school students actually ran story exchanges, with adults in the room, of course, for each other. And it was really exciting to see that practice begin to spread in the school and to hear them empathize with each other in a somewhat competitive environment. So I'll take any more questions if anybody wants, or comments or anything. I do also realize that you're on the tail end of a 2-day Zoom conference. So if you're zoomed out, that's also fine. Well, if nobody has anything else, I'm happy to let you reclaim 12 minutes of your afternoon. And yeah, I would love to hear from everybody. So once again, my email is evan@narrative4.com. And I hope that I get to meet your students and, bring them a little bit of joy. Actually, I should say they have the joy in themselves. They just need to share it with each other. Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie and James to wrap it up.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us. Just make sure before you leave today, I'll go ahead and post the link in the chat again. Be sure to fill out our conference evaluation. There it is. And have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining us for the last couple days. Really appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules, and hope that you were able to get a lot out of this conference and have some ideas that you can take back to your programs. Again, thank you so much. It'll give you a few minutes back in your day, and link is in the chat there. Be sure to fill out the conference evaluation. If you are a licensed provider, you will receive a confirmation about your participation for your ECE TRIS credit. So that will be coming. And again, just reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.